One of the discoveries that has really rocked the evolutionary world was made by Dr. Mary Schweitzer and Dr. Jack Horner from analyzing the interior, the bone marrow, if you will, of the thigh bone or the femur of a T-Rex that was excavated back in 2003. Their report was published in the March-April 2005 edition of Science Magazine, a very prestigious, peer-reviewed science magazine. And they reported, and to my left are pictures, just a few pictures, there's many more that were actually in the magazine. They reported soft, stretchable, elastic, snap back like a rubber band tissue in that thigh bone. In addition, they reported finding red blood vessels that still had blood cells in them that were identifiable, and all of that would be impossible if this dinosaur died out 65 to 68 million years ago. Clearly, science has shown this dinosaur died out very recently.
When she picked up a small piece to stop the reaction by putting it in water, it stretched and it sproinged and it moved all over the place. So we knew we had something pretty unusual.
It appears to be soft tissue. When they look at neighboring parts of the bone, they're even more surprised.
Out popped the blood vessels, and they were pretty incredible. And I said, I don't believe it, that's not possible. We need to do it again and again. It's one of those just goosebump-inducing scientific moments, that's all I can say. And they don't really happen very often.
Blood vessels should not exist in fossilized bone. Many scientists believe organic molecules can't last more than 100,000 years. Yet Schweitzer's bone is 68 million years old.
I think the presence of soft tissues and cells indicates there's a process going on that we didn't have a clue about. So I think it means that we have to kind of rethink the whole chemical process of making a bone turn into a fossil.
By the way, did you notice she didn't say, we need to rethink the time? You know why? They won't rethink the time. They can't. They've got to have their millions of years or they can't propose evolution. She said, we'll rethink the chemical process, but not the time.
Doctors Mary Schweitzer and Jack Horner are paleontologists. They study fossils. Specifically, they're interested in dinosaurs. In fact, I think you could call Jack Horner Mr. Dinosaur. I mean, he's probably associated with the study of dinosaurs as much or more than anyone else that comes to mind.
Mary Schweitzer said that on one such test, she said she couldn't believe it until she'd done it 17 times. This is pretty thorough.
So most people are understandably shocked, and that includes certainly evolutionists, that you should find what appears to be fresh marrow. Still soft, still with blood vessels, still with red blood cells. More recently, they've gone beyond that. Schweitzer, working with other investigators, have looked at the biochemistry of the marrow, and they have indeed found protein fragments. Now, not the whole protein, but protein fragments. Proteins usually don't remain completely undisturbed for a few thousand years, and of course we have no idea for 70 million.
Well, of course, the evolutionary naturalists who embrace the long ages of evolution, who maintain adamantly that man and dinosaur are separate by 65 million years, are very, very uncomfortable with these continuing discoveries of Mary Schweitzer. Mary Schweitzer said in Discover magazine, April of 2006, quote, I had one reviewer tell me he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none, end quote. And so here's a perfect example of where people are saying, I have my unproved theory of evolution that spans many, many millions of years, where there's no creator, no designer, it's just time, chance, and natural processes, but the facts don't line up with it. I'd rather hold on to the theory than the facts.
In National Bridges National Monument, Utah, there's actually some carvings, petroglyphs, done by the Indians that even an evolutionist in an evolutionary textbook says looks like a sauropod dinosaur. And we've actually had a team go out there, they've seen it, photographed it, did a wax cloth impression of it, and it just looks like a sauropod dinosaur.
This
mosaic dates to 100 BC that shows a portion of life on the Nile, and it shows what seems to clearly be an ornithischian dinosaur. It's a quadruped dinosaur with a long neck and a long tail and what seems to clearly look like a bird's-like beak. The only animals that we know of, a quadruped animal with a mouth like that, are the ornithischian dinosaurs. Dates to 100 BC.
The exact date was 1186 AD. And it's a stone temple. It's in the Angkor Wat temple complex around Cambodia. And in a jungle area.
There's a number of stone carvings of things that are familiar to us today, along with Hindu and Buddhist mythology. And very distinctively, there's one that looks very much like a stegosaur, as reconstructed from fossils by scientists. And the question becomes, how did the people who carved that stone 800 years ago have carved so beautifully a stegosaur without having had any knowledge about what's in today's encyclopedias? And the clear conclusion is they were familiar with those creatures because they were alive at the same time.
Unless it was living, how could they get its anatomy correct? They had to see it in order to reproduce it correctly. And that's just one of over 80 instances around the world in every single continent where it's been found that humans and dinosaurs have coexisted because the humans have reproduced dinosaurs in one art form or another.
There's a cathedral in the UK, Carlisle Cathedral, which has been there a very long time. And one of the bishops buried there 600 years ago has, on the brass trimmings around his tomb, a number of engravings of animals, many of which are familiar to us today, but there's also some that look very much like sauropod dinosaurs. In fact, any 21st century child would immediately recognise them as being sauropod dinosaurs. And so when we think about the evolutionary view that says dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, and then we look at these sauropod dinosaur engravings on this 600-year-old tomb, how did they get there?
The oldest artifact that we have, period, is an Egyptian slate that commemorates an Egyptian king. And Hierakonpolis slate is one of the names given to this artifact. And on one side it shows him grasping the head of his recently defeated foe and about to chop the head off. So it's a slate saying, look how great I am. And on the back, it's got some Egyptians with ropes around necks of two great sauropod looking, I mean, they look just like a children's book with a apatosaurus on it or something, necks intertwined. And we have this motif repeated on two different, totally different places, separated by hundreds of years.
Obviously, if there are engravings of sauropod dinosaurs which are hundreds of years old, prior to any scientists' reconstructions of fossils, the only way that we could say that they could have done it so intelligently was if they had viewed the creatures for themselves, or at least had access to sketches or drawings or descriptions made by eyewitnesses of those creatures at around that time.
As some people look at the fossil record, as some people look at evidence that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, they see pictures, they see drawings, they see carvings, they see work in metal and weaving of individuals that have actually reproduced dinosaurs. And the American Indian is one of those groups that has done that, especially in paintings and drawings.
Adrienne Mayer, first of all, if we talk about what she's done on this, I think we ought to give her credit for doing a tremendous amount of research. And when I say data, I mean legend after legend after legend after legend of descriptions of the same kinds of creatures that were giant, terrible lizards. There were thunderbirds, there were water monsters given the same description from tribe after tribe after tribe across North America, but even in South America and Central America. We've got this robust, legendary lore, complete with descriptions of habitat, descriptions of habit, anatomical attributes. Where did all this come from?
And some people say, well, we don't want to have the Indian living at the dinosaur. So the Indian went ahead and found bones, and then went ahead and assembled those bones into the proper shape, and then put the musculature and the skin on the bones, and then based upon what they came up with, they then did a drawing showing what this dinosaur or reptile would look like in life. Now, with all due respect to the skills of the American Indian, and there are a great many of them, I honestly don't know if paleontology hundreds of years ago was one of them.
Well, the very fact that we have these artifacts begs the question, how did they know to draw these? In other words, if they're mythological, how is it that they all drew the same exact myth, and yet they're separated through distant time as well as distant geography? And the question, it's a tough one to answer because it depends on your worldview. And if you back up and think, if I just go based on the data, then it seems to suggest on its surface that these people, real live people, at some point encountered creatures that looked like this.
Here's Bishop Bell, his tomb in Carlisle Cathedral. You see the creatures there. They look like dinosaurs, and look, they've got their necks wrapped around each other too, just like the Mesopotamian cylinder seal, separated hundreds of years chronologically and hundreds of miles distance geographically, and yet people record the same activity.
First of all, what we have to understand now, it was not until the year 1822 when Gideon Mantle and his wife found the iguanodon tooth. And that was supposedly the absolute beginning of our understanding of dinosaurs. And modern academia will tell you that is when we discovered them. Well, the problem with that is that we have all these images of ancient people groups that had intimate knowledge of dinosaurs. They drew them on vases, they were on pottery, and if it is true that they had no knowledge of dinosaurs, then where in the world did all those images come from?
Okay, so when we start looking for evidence of dinosaurs in recent history, one of the things that we got to remember up front is that the word dinosaur itself is very, very new. Okay, originally coined about 1841, 1842. When the creationist by the name of creation paleontologist by the name of Richard Owen used the word in a lecture for the first time. But dinosaurs have only recently been discovered. To my knowledge, maybe off by a year or two here, the first dinosaur discovered was the iguanodon, which was discovered in 1822. 1822. And they found a tooth of an iguanodon and took it to an expert, the zoologist, and he thought it looked like an iguana's tooth, a really big iguana's tooth. They called it the iguanodon, first dinosaur discovered. But the word dinosaur itself is relatively new, again meaning terrible lizard. But up until this word was coined very recently, 1840s, these kind of animals were just collectively known as dragons.
If people and dinosaurs have interacted, then there should be evidence of it.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is you will often see sometimes people equate dinosaurs with dragons. You've heard creationists say that before. There's dragon legends all over the world from virtually all people groups. They've described seeing these huge reptilian beasts,
right,
et cetera, et cetera. And this has been kind of mythologized. But even in the World Book Encyclopedia in 1973, we hear this quote: "The dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like the great reptiles, dinosaurs, which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on earth." So they're even noting this. They're saying, well, wait a sec. If people have these descriptions of creatures that sound like dinosaurs, call them dragons because dinosaurs is a modern word, that's kind of strange because dinosaurs and people aren't supposed to have lived together.
Right.
And a scientist and an atheist, Louis Jacobs, author and former president of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, made this really startling claim here. He said, well, you don't want to associate dinosaurs with dragons. Why? Such an association would dispel an earth with vast antiquity. The entire history of creation, including the day of rest, could be accommodated in the 7 biblical days of the Genesis myth. Evolution would be vanquished. That is huge. He's saying, wait a second, don't equate dinosaurs and dragons because that's going to blow evolution out of the water.
So if dinosaurs lived recently, that blows the evolutionary timescale out, which of course destroys evolution itself.
Exactly, and then you can't be an atheist because you have to believe in evolution to be an atheist. So what is some of the evidence here? Well,
dragons. Just the word conjures up all these images, and people's attention goes right to the dragons. People want to know about dragons.
Dragon legend is absolutely a phenomenon. There are literally too many legends to count. They're in every tribe and nation, every people group, and you have them in China, Australia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America, everywhere people inhabit.
Dragons are really interesting creatures. I think there's not a child with soul so dead that he hasn't become fascinated by dragon stories and dragon legends. And the thing that's always struck me as amazing is that it's not a regional legend. It's not a legend of the Chinese but nobody else, or a legend of the Europeans and nobody else. It's everybody's legend.
Now, a legend is, of course, a legend. It's a fairy tale. But is there, in fact, most anthropologists will tell you that whenever you have a legend or mythology, that there's usually something that happened that started that myth.
So the point is there is some consistent threads in these different cultures, South Sea Islands, South Pacific, American Indians, and so forth. So when you find the similar kinds of legends that suggest that either a common legend exchange or those legends deriving from some kind of historical antecedent.
If we're to believe that they're mythological, that really presents a logical problem for us, because there is a consistency that happens throughout all the dragon legends. Of course, dragon legends can become sensational. You know, a lot of your pagan religions attach some sort of meaning to these things. Like a lot of times in Chinese mythology, a dragon would, be responsible for the tides, or it would control the water or something like that. But if you scrape away all the sensationalism, you actually have a very real creature at the bottom of, and that is consistent throughout really the entire world. You just have a large scaled reptile that has many of them fly, some of them don't, but the ones that do fly have wings like a bat, and they're carnivorous, and they're basically going to gnaw your face off. And it is consistent no matter where you go, and that truly is remarkable.
They look like big reptiles with long tails, with scales, with sharp teeth, claws, oftentimes 3 claws, by the way, which many of the dinosaurs did have 3 claws, like the theropods. So I believe they're what many people have called dragons, or have been translated to the word dragon, really reflect a human experience, widespread among almost all cultures, of having witnessed at some point in history very, very large, very frightening reptiles.
You know, the dragon legends, the stories of these dragons, they always talk about these huge reptilian beasts with fierce teeth and prickly spines, and they just sound so much like dinosaurs.
It's like knowing about Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. We have to rely on historical records of these things, because you can't scientifically prove that Julius Caesar existed. It's always a matter of history. And I think dragons, a lot of that will be widespread historical writings of such creatures, including, for instance, the Chinese calendar, where you have 12 animals. One of them is a dragon. I was born in the year of a dragon, but all the animals are treated as equally real. So it does seem like the Chinese people did see a creature we would now call a dragon, which they called the Long.
We also got to keep in mind that when we look at some of these accounts, that the word serpent has changed through time. A lot of the records refer to them as serpents or dragons, and often there are many these ancient histories, these ancient cultures had many names for dragons. The dragons were known by different names in different areas, or in different countries or regions, but not only were there several types of dragons described, but they had different names in these different areas, sometimes referred to as serpents. But like I say, the meaning of the word serpent has changed. In Old English diction, a serpent was a reptile with a long neck and a long tail. A snake itself is a legless serpent.
There are a lot of legends of dragons being used for breeding. The Chinese have stories about breeding dragons. There are artifacts that show people riding these things.
It's quite remarkable that, to many people, that Australian Aboriginal people actually have accounts of their ancestors having encountered creatures that today, by any reckoning, you'd describe as being dinosaurs on the basis of scientists' reconstructions from fossils. On a personal level, I recall meeting a university researcher in the Northern Territory in Darwin after giving a presentation there a couple of years ago. And she said that she'd been working with the local Larrakia Aboriginal people. And they had a word for a fierce creature that lived in the local swamps there that used to terrorise the first Aboriginal people who'd come to that area via canoes from another country far away. And when this university researcher said to them, "Oh, that word obviously means crocodile," the Larrakia people responded, "No, we've got a different word for crocodile. This other creature, in fact, looks very similar to some of your dinosaurs in your children's book about dinosaurs."
There is an Indian legend called the Thunderbirds. And according to legend, these huge bird-like creatures would fly and they would actually be able to bring thunder with them. And at first that seems sensational. But if you start looking at the evidence, things change just a little bit. Because what is in the Black Hills in South Dakota, the legend is that these giant thunderbirds would actually fly to the top of the Black Hills and they would like nest there. Now what is fascinating is that scientists have long believed that those kind of gigantic creatures needed strong winds to propel them to high heights. And so in the west, where you have these gigantic thunderstorms, it is really postulated that these gigantic pteranodons would catch thermal updrafts of these storms that would lift them to the top of places like the Black Hills. So from an Indian's perspective that is trying to pull meaning from the things in nature, they would look at these what they would call thunderbirds and go, wow, they are bringing thunder. But it's actually what's really happening is that it's the thunderstorms that are actually bringing the pteranodons.
This is taken from a book named After the Flood, where he recounts, "Dinosaurs in the form of flying reptiles were a feature of Welsh life until surprisingly recent times. As late as the beginning of the present century, elderly folk at Penllyn in Glamorgan used to tell of a colony of winged serpents that lived in the woods around Penllyn Castle. As Mary Trevelyan tells us, the woods around Penllyn Castle, Glamorgan, had the reputation of being frequented by winged serpents, and these were the terror of old and young alike. An aged inhabitant of Penllyn, who died a few years ago, said that in his boyhood the winged serpents were described as very beautiful. He said it was no old story invented to frighten children, but a real fact. His father and uncle had killed some of them, for they were as bad as foxes for poultry. The old man attributed the extinction of the winged serpents to the fact that they were terrors in the farmyards and coverts." This is a pteranodon, an example of one. And by the way, not all of them were huge with big long wings. And in Beowulf, it describes two different kinds. One which had massive, huge wings, which we know existed from fossils, 30 foot and more wingspan. But there's another kind of winged serpent that was smaller, but it was just as much a pest. Not just in Beowulf, but in England and to the North American Indians and Central American Indians, etc.
Interestingly, there's a Scandinavian king called Beowulf, and there's a very famous poem about his exploits. And if you read about his description of this big beast that he killed because it was terrorizing the villagers, it's a very accurate description of a Tyrannosaurus rex.
Most people say Beowulf is entirely mythical because there's all these monsters in it. But if you read Beowulf, the poem, it doesn't say fairies and magic elves. It's talking about the Grendel. It's talking about a bipedal monster with giant mouth and big teeth that ate people, just like we might imagine a theropod dinosaur might do.
He first ended up slaughtering several dragons that were terrorizing shipping lanes, brought them out, laid them out for inspection, then took on the dragon that was terrorizing the Great Hall, a dragon that they called the Grendel, which is described as walking like a man or being like a man as if it was bipedal. Very stealthy, apparently, was able to sneak in and grab one of Beowulf's soldiers completely undetected on one occasion. And they eventually killed the Grendel, Beowulf did, by ripping one of its arms off. And if you think about these theropod dinosaurs, that was probably one of the most vulnerable aspects of these big creatures was their little bitty arms. And it is said, at least one author suggested, that this was a known strategy for killing these big, formidable types of dragons. Beowulf apparently lost his life later by taking on a winged serpent that was also in the area. Now, there is some substantial archaeological evidence to suggest that at least the people, the places, and buildings described in the book of Beowulf appear to be actual. So they've been able to find grave mounds. These two grave mounds are of people were verified by archaeologists to have belonged to two of the people mentioned in the legend of Beowulf. They found the hall, the great hall of the king who was being terrorized by the Grendel. They have found that hall. Archaeologists found that hall. They've also uncovered Beowulf's grave mound. There was a person named Beowulf, and his grave mound was enormous in comparison to the others in the region, the other people of that time. So a lot of archaeological evidence has established that Beowulf, many of the people, their relationships, the great halls, existed at the time and the place described in the epic Beowulf. So if the story of the dragon and that Beowulf killed is fictitious, an author wove an extraordinary amount of factual data into a fictitious story. It'd be very, very puzzling. Bill Cooper, I don't know if the book's back there, I didn't have a time to check, wrote a book called After the Flood, in which he describes the epic of Beowulf in these terms and the significance of the Grendel, which was not the name of that particular serpent, but that was the name of those types of serpents. But he suggests that this carving that dates to between the 8th and 10th century BC, a Saxon carving, may actually show the creature that is called the Grendel in the Beowulf story. It shows what appears to be bipedal animals, one there, attacking a herd of quadrupeds. So this one seems to be turning around, looking at its attacker, but it's a huge bipedal animal that appears to be attacking another herd. Again, date between the 8th and 10th century.
You know, St. George and the Dragon. That was written as real
Famous
history.
dragon legend,
yeah,
yes.
But of course, you know, it's been mythologized. The flag of Wales actually has a dragon on it. Some of the biblical commentaries from several hundred years ago actually referenced people seeing dragons.
Right. Very old books.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Zodiac, the Chinese Zodiac, has all these animals that we readily recognize, modern, and it's got
Real
a dragon.
animals,
Yeah.
plus a dragon.
Why one mythological dragon? Marco Polo, you know, he was a well-known historian, and he describes seeing these huge reptilian beasts, these dragons.
Marco Polo also described seeing dragons in China. This is a description, and there are several descriptions like this from Marco Polo. Here are found snakes and huge serpents. So see, there's a difference. 10 paces in length and 10 spans in girth, which equates to like 50 feet or 10 inches. At the forepart, the front near the head, they have 2 short legs, each with 3 claws, as well as eyes larger than a loaf and very glaring. The jaws are wide enough to swallow a man. The teeth are large and sharp, and their whole appearance is so formidable that neither man nor any kind of animal can approach them without terror. Others are of smaller size, being 8, 6, or 5 paces long. What small arms up front? 3 claws? What is that? It's one of these, definitely one of the big theropods, right? One of these big beast-footed creatures. Very, very compelling. Alexander the Great also reported seeing dragons in 530 BC. When he was going through India, it was reported that the people of India were worshiping a great serpent that was living in a cave there. It is also said that one of his generals brought back a serpent. The gargoyle itself, the name that we apply to the water spouts that are placed on top of buildings is said to have been derived from a dragon that was attacking in a river in France. The story goes that, if I remember this correctly, a bishop ended up going out using a prisoner, managed to capture a dragon that was terrorizing this community, led it back into town, and when it got it back into town, the townspeople set upon it, killed it, burned it, and then mounted the head upon the cathedral. The head was later replaced by a sculpture, and they ended up calling that sculpture what the dragon had originally been called. That was a gargoyle. But I should mention that creating water spouts like this that were carved after animals and even people goes back to the date of the Egyptians. So we've been creating these for long, long periods of time. But the name itself, the gargoyle name, seems to be derived back from this one particular incident with the dragon. There was a dragon in Poland in the 8th century. Krakow, Poland itself is named after a dragon, or after the king or person who killed a dragon there. The dragon is either called the Wawel dragon or the dragon of Krakow. This is a statue that's on the river near where the dragon's cave is reported to be. We can find them on flags. There are cities named after people, after either dragons or the person who killed a dragon. We find them on city seals. Every natural history book before the 1800s contains descriptions and, in cases, if possible, depictions of dragons. Okay? Now, whenever you see pictures like this, one of the things you got to do is overlook the fact that there are some oddities to it and look at it for the basic elements that it contains. Okay? Now, most dinosaurs had one of two types of mouths. Either they had big teeth, like a lion, or they had beaks, like birds. Okay? And so when people were describing these kind of things, they would tend to say, well, it kind of had a mouth kind of like a lion. And they would end up drawing, well, some guy that's going to draw that out doesn't know how to draw the rest of the head, except to draw the rest of the head also look like a lion. So I find a lot of these depictions end up having heads that look more like cats than what we would recognize. But I think it's from the description itself, from the tiny type of teeth that they saw. It had teeth like a lion. But let's look at the rest of this. Now, this actually came from a real a record of a shepherd who had seen a dragon while out with his sheep. But look at this thing for what it actually has. A long neck and a long tail, 3 fingers, 3 toes, and look, it's got a crown-like structure on its head. These are the basic characteristics of most theropods. Okay? Long necks, long tails, 3 fingers, 3 toes, and a great many of them had what you would describe, if you saw this, to be a crown-like structure on your head. Now let's look back at that picture again, and instead of criticizing that poor shepherd, think about whether you would have been able to give a better description of that thing had you seen it. Huh? Would you have stood around and took notes of the kinds of color patterns and how the light shimmered off its scales and stuff? Man, you would have been boogieing the other direction, you know what I mean? But, and realistically, how far off was it? I'm not saying this is the exact animal that guy saw, but when you look at these, generally speaking, I found a lot of descriptions and depictions that fit dinosaurs I could kind of recognize from looking at some of these things. Okay.
Of course, Dracorex. You did an article on that in Creation Magazine.
Yeah, a little article.
And what does it look like? Even the people who funded it here, there's a little sign down there. It says it's a dinosaur that looks like a dragon. Well, that's what we've been saying all along.
To make the connection between dinosaurs and dragons even stronger. Here's a thing that looks
exactly
like a dragon.
Yeah. Carl Sagan, once called the smartest man in America. Of course, he's an atheist, wrote the book Dragons of Eden, trying to explain why people groups all over the world have these memories of seeing these dinosaurs that they call dragons.
So he's not a Christian. What did he say?
Well, basically, he came up with this thought that basically in our past, when we were just some greedy little mammal or something, we saw these dinosaurs, and it was so frightening that it imprinted in our memories, somehow in our DNA. And that memory got passed along till finally we evolved into humans. Here we are, and we remember seeing these things. But of course, we didn't live with this. That's preposterous.
And that's what he said in his book.
That's what he said in his book.
Wow.
He makes a connection between dragons. He says that many cultures have these legends and all that kind of stuff. So just astounding evidence.
If you only had 1 or 2 stories that sounded a bit similar to dinosaurs, you could see it as just a coincidence. But when you have this universal theme right across the globe, many different continents, many different cultures, and over a vast span of human history, then there's probably going to have to be some universal core truth there. In fact, the late Dr. Carl Sagan, one of the most well-known of all the world's evolutionists, took it so seriously that he actually wrote a book called The Dragons of Eden to try and answer this question as to how come there are so many different stories of dragons that are very similar to the dinosaurs when no one's ever seen a dinosaur? And the answer he came up with in his book was essentially that, well, we evolved from reptiles, so part of our brain is a sort of a leftover of when we lived in the age of the reptiles, and so dragon legends are really, if you like, inherited memories from the age of reptiles. Now, there was an embarrassed silence from many of his evolutionary colleagues because, of course, there's no scientific credibility to the idea that memories are inherited. You know, that you might remember what some ancestor did when he was serving Cleopatra or something like that. But the importance of that little account was that one of the world's leading evolutionists took this issue so seriously that he tried to explain it, even though he didn't do a very good job. A much better explanation is that the Bible is right, that man and dinosaur did live together, and what we see are the somewhat corrupted legends, somewhat corrupted stories of a time when people and dinosaurs did really know each other.
You know, it's funny how historians treat ancient history, because we've got a lot of ancient historians writing things that we take today as matter of fact, like, you know, this event happened, okay. But then when they start talking about some other things that they believed were true, historians will just discount it. Like, you know, Marco Polo's writing about dragons, Alexander the Great's talking about his giant lizard that frightened his army. And there's all sorts of other accounts in history as matter-of-fact accounts of great lizard-like beasts, and yet they're routinely discredited as not being true.
You know, it is a misnomer that some of these dragon legends, or all the dragon legends, are just a product of opium-inspired pagan religions. I mean, that is not the case at all. What you have is you have actual historians. You have Herodotus, you have Flavius Josephus, you have Marco Polo that talk about dragons. Herodotus actually heard an account of flying reptiles, and he went and checked it out himself. And so, I mean, he showed the mettle of a true historian. 400 years later or so, you have Flavius Josephus, an incredible Jewish historian, also talking about seemingly the same creature. You have this flying reptile. You have Marco Polo that after his journey to China is describing a huge dragon. He calls it a dragon with this tail that is really dragging through the sand, leaving these marks. And we come to the point where we have to ask ourselves, are all these people just making this up? They're describing creatures that were not supposed to be alive then. According to evolutionary theory, that creatures like this were supposed to be separated by mankind for 65 to 70 million years. Yet, here we have respectable people writing in their history books, this is what I've seen, this is what I've witnessed. And they sound just like dinosaurs.
Well, I think we should take the testimony of these very reliable historians. For the most part, I think that they were very candid in what they were writing about when it came to historical narrative. And if they were talking about these large, formidable creatures, I don't see why there's any reason to question that.
If man and dinosaurs never lived together but were separated by millions of years, then we have to say all those ancients were mistaken. And I don't believe that we should accuse them of that because they were intelligent people like you and I.
The Bible does use the term dragons over and over again. It talks about ocean dragons, it talks about flying dragons, it talks about land dragons. And you know, that seems to fit with these great reptilian beasts that include the dinosaurs. And it makes sense. If those things were so dominant on the planet before the flood and certainly right after the flood, they would have made it into the history of the culture.
In 1845, a newspaper in the town of Geelong in Victoria published a sketch of a creature that the local Aboriginal people had described as a bunyip.
Common Aboriginal term for monster, it's often thought of as mythical, but this Aboriginal had big, deep claw marks across his chest, and the description he gave, presumably through an interpreter at the time, was the basis of this sketch in the Geelong Advertiser, and it looks very much like one of the duck-billed dinosaurs. In fact, some large bones were reported at that time that were fresh and were unlike any other creature that people were familiar with at the time.
And 13 years later, on the other side of the world, a dinosaur was unearthed, and it was called Edmontosaurus. And when you look at a reconstruction of Edmontosaurus next to the sketch of the bunyip, drawn by the artist for the newspaper in Geelong on the basis of Aboriginal descriptions, the two are very similar.
You have to interpret evidence of the present in relation to the past. And what I would say is this: there is very strong circumstantial evidence, because all evidence in relation to the past is like a forensic scientist. They're working with circumstantial evidence, is very strongly confirms the Bible's history that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. We think many of your dragon legends could actually be stories about what we today call dinosaurs.
The reason why you don't find the word dinosaur in the Bible is the same reason why you don't find words like computer or locomotive, because all of those words were invented in the English language well after the Bible was translated into English.
The word dinosaur wasn't invented until 1841 by Sir Richard Owen, who was head of the British Museum. Before that, words such as dragon were used in the Bible.
The King James Bible was first translated into English in 1611. So the word dinosaur is a modern word.
There is a distinct philosophy that is able to be identified when you look at the King James Version of the Bible that was first printed in 1611 to the more modern translations in English language like the ESV. In 1611, they used the word dragon 35 times. In the Old Testament alone, they used the plural word dragon 16 times. But if you look at the ESV today, they use the word dragons in the plural form 0. And what is very clear to see is that whenever dragon is used to refer to a real living, breathing creature that walks upon land, the ESV has decided that that is not a word that can be used. Most of the time, they replace it with jackal, which is like a little hairy dog. Now that is a big discrepancy between a small, hairy, fox-like creature and a big, gigantic reptile-like creature. And what you see is that the evolutionary mindset has seeped into so many things that we have even our most conservative Bible theologians look at dragons. They do not make the connection between dragon and dinosaur, and they have the idea that, wow, dragons aren't real, and so we have to protect the inerrancy of the Bible.
Most of the people believe that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, and therefore humans couldn't possibly have seen them because they haven't been around that long. So it's a case of a faulty view of history with this millions of years imposed upon it, which means they have to try to explain away human encounters with creatures which we would call dragons.
But sometimes we treat God like he's a little old lady that needs help crossing the street. No, I believe that God said what he means, and he means what he said. So if dinosaurs and dragons really are one and the same, one might actually ask, well, why did dragons fade into mythology to begin with? And that's a really good question.
So you had all cultures in the world essentially passing on stories about big lizards. And over time, those stories get corrupted, they get distorted. It's a fish story of the day, they get this added or that added, and all of a sudden they become magical and they cast spells in at least a modern fantasy literature.
I think that a dinosaur is described in detail more than most other animals in the Bible. I really do. For instance, when you go to Job 40, there we have an account of God speaking with a man called Job, and this was after the flood. And he was saying to Job, look at this animal called behemoth.
Now that's just not an English word, that's just a transliteration of a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word there is plural because behemoth is a well-known word for a beast. So behemoth is saying it's the beast of beasts, and God said to Job, behold this. So he was expecting Job to understand what he was talking about, and what I made along with you. So it implies that it was made alongside mankind. And then it says, so it's a beast of beasts made along with mankind.
Everything about it is big. His legs are big. His bones are strong like brass and iron. He's an enormous creature, chief of the ways of God. Some Hebrew experts say that means it was the largest land animal God made. And the largest land animal we know of today from the fossil record are some of your dinosaurs, like your sauropods, like a Seismosaurus or something. And then it has a tail like a cedar. Well, you think of the cedars of Lebanon. I mean, a tail like a cedar, that'd be an enormous tail. Many Bible commentaries, for instance, the NIV Study Bible in the notes actually says this was a hippopotamus or an elephant. But a hippopotamus tail is like a little flap of skin. And, an elephant's tail is like a piece of rope hanging in the wind.
It's really difficult to know why many commentators, even conservative commentators, are unwilling to take the descriptions in the book of Job about this creature and to try to apply them to a hippopotamus or some other animal when the description doesn't fit. I suppose only they themselves know their motives, and the Lord. Is it that they're afraid of looking foolish or, scientifically simplistic or whatever? But it is very clear that the description of the animal there in Job's book is not a hippopotamus.
When we look at the description of that creature, it really does seem to fit with a brachiosaur or a Patasaurus, sauropod type dinosaur.
You read the description of behemoth while looking at a fossil at, say, the Pittsburgh Carnegie Mellon Museum of Natural History, and limbs like great bars of iron, That's exactly the way it looks. Doesn't mean the bones were made out of iron. It means they were just like great big bronze tubes and iron tubes, and these big ribs, this immense belly, this big tail. I mean, we're clearly not describing a pussycat. This fits a dinosaur.
Well, Leviathan in Job 41 was not a dinosaur because technically the word dinosaur only refers to land animals. So we could say a dinosaur-like creature, if you like, that lived in the sea. The Bible describes it as a dragon that lives in the sea.
This thing is about the size of a school bus and weighed 8 tons. And just as Leviathan is described as leaving a trail in the mud with, potsherds, like shattered pieces of pottery, that's the sort of trail that a crocodile makes in the mud. But you're not talking about the crocodile that we know nowadays. If you look at this picture of a modern-day crocodile skull, and this Sarcosuchus skull around it, you can see the vast difference in size. And it truly fits the description in the book of Job, where it talks about how, this sort of creature would just shrug off harpoons and arrows and laugh at fish hooks and things like this. And also, the book of Job describes as if it has rows of shields closely interlocking with no space between them. And it's interesting that the description of Sarcosuchus includes the many scutes that have been found, and these are like the big scales, and they are closely overlocking, and they're about 1 foot in diameter, these shields on Leviathan.
It says it breathed fire. Now when people look at that, they say, well, now we know the Bible can't be trusted because that's just a mythical creature breathing fire. I say, whoa, wait a minute. Who says animals can't breathe fire? I mean, think about it. We have a little beetle called the bombardier beetle that can mix chemicals like hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide together and blast out hot gases at 212 degrees Fahrenheit to put a frog off its lunch.
You look at the electric eel, the ability to electrocute. You look at the spitting cobra that uses a huge gust of air from its lungs to really create an aerosol type effect for its venom that shoots out and will hit the eyes of attackers or enemies. You start looking at some of these things, you're like, okay, is it possible that these eyewitness accounts really did have some evidence behind them?
Interestingly, the snout of Sarcosuchus had a bulla, some sort of a hollow cavity of some sort at the tip that nobody knows exactly what it was for. Could that have been for mixing of chemicals or some sort of a chamber, some sort of a chemical storage chamber for generating the fire and smoke that the book of Job also describes concerning Leviathan?
There's an apocryphal chapter of the book of Daniel that contains a description of a dragon. It's a chapter. It's in the Catholic Bible. It's not in the Protestant Bible. It's possible that it's removal, but I'm not advocating one way or the other. Okay, just meant its removal might have been due to the fact that the early translators again didn't believe that animals like this existed at the time of Daniel. Nonetheless, there's a chapter, apocryphal chapter 41, that's called Bel and the Dragon, that is an encounter between Daniel and that reads like this. And in that place there was a great dragon, which they of Babylon worship. Now, to understand this completely, there was an encounter just before this. They were worshiping an idol and coming in and giving it food every day. And in the morning, they would return and the food would be gone. And the king proclaimed to Daniel that this was evidence that this God was a real God eating this food. And so Daniel devised a test to show that people were actually coming in and eating the food. Okay? And so after this, he mentions the dragon that they were also worshiping. And the king said unto Daniel, wilt thou also say that this is of brass, like the idol? Well, he liveth, for he liveth. He eateth and he drinketh. Thou cannot say that he is no living God, and therefore worship him. Then said Daniel unto the king, I will worship the Lord my God, for he is the living God. But give me leave, O king, and I shall slay this dragon without sword or staff. The king said, I give thee leave. Then Daniel took pitch, fat, and hair, and did seeth them together, and made lumps thereof. This he put into the dragon's mouth. And so the dragon burst in asunder. And Daniel said, Lo, these are the gods ye worship. There is a dragon, an engraving, a carving of a dragon on the Ishtar Gate that was outside of Babylon that dates to 575 BC. Although very idealized, like many of the drawings we see, it does offer some substantiation that the people of Babylon may have worshipped these gigantic serpent-like creatures. In every single account of a dragon that I found, there was also within that account descriptions of the attempts to kill it or the slaughter of the thing. And that appears to be the common theme. And it tends to be reasonable, okay? What would happen to one today? Unless we had the wildlife agency jump on the thing and capture it real quick, if we saw one of those running around a couple miles from here, you know, a hunting party would be going out there quick trying to kill that thing. That's what we tend to do. It wasn't long ago, I had a neighbor of mine, when his wife came because there was a snake in her front yard. And she wanted me to get rid of this snake. But she didn't want me to just get rid of it. She wanted me to kill it. Don't go. I went and turned it loose, you know, but she didn't want me to turn that thing loose out there where it's just going to come back. You kill that thing. You know, that's what we do. If it has a threatening imposition, and reptiles are about as threatening as animals get to most people. If it has a threatening imposition, and if it's in any way harmful to our livelihoods, our stock, our poultry, our cattle, if there's a harm to them, we're going to send a hunting party out and kill it. Okay? I mean, there may be other theories as to why they killed the dragons. I don't know. You know, people in, I don't know. People eat lots of things. Maybe they taste like chicken. We don't know. We just don't know. But no, I think, this is very funny. But one of the best known accounts, there are a lot of people that were sainted for killing dragons. People became knights and saints for killing dragons. One of the best known is probably St. George. There are cathedrals built after St. George pretty much in every country in the world. I would challenge you to find one where there's not a cathedral built after St. George, one of the best known of the saints that had killed a dragon. But in looking into this, I found an extensive list. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. I just assembled this really, really quick of people who were sainted by the Catholic Church for killing dragons in the first 7 centuries AD. People that were sainted for killing dragons. And there were some interesting stories there. One of the ones that kind of caught my eye was one of them was even Martha of Bethany, who was Lazarus' sister, who apparently did move to France in a missionary capacity and died there and was buried in France. But according to the story, she was involved with the killing of a dragon that the people were afraid of called a Tarrasque. And according to the story, she went out and fed the thing and gained its trust, led it back into town. Townspeople set upon it and killed the thing. But the Tarrasque is still featured in some Corpus Christi processions even today. It looks to me, if you look at, go look it up. I didn't generate a picture for you. But if you go look it up, it also has scutes on its back and a big club on its tail frequently. Looks very much like an ankylosaur again. I would think one of the last probably surviving members. Now, when I started looking up, I found so many accounts of people who were sainted or missionaries. This thing caught my eye, and I kind of questioned, why would a Christian take it upon themselves to kill one of these creatures? You know, and I think there was obvious reasons for it. A missionary, a person that was trying to spread the gospel, the word of Christ, would reach some village, and everyone was afraid of these. There's some serpent out there, and everyone was terrified of this thing. Around these creatures, there tend to be a lot of superstition. They tend to refer to these in very superstitious terms, and idolatry. Okay, and I think trying to help this culture, trying to gain their trust, lead them to Christ, that would be the natural thing that they would do. They wouldn't be afraid of this thing. They don't have superstitious tendencies. People that believe in Jesus don't tend to have those superstitious tendencies, would have been less afraid of the creature, would have gone out and, Martha may not have known that the people would have killed it when she brought it back in. And I'm not sure, can actually say for certain whether that tale is actually true. But you can go in and look it up. I also found lots and lots of engravings like this. This is a picture of what appears to be the lion described as Christ killing a basilisk. Remember, the basilisk was one of the ones that was kind of quadrupedal, had the crown on its head, probably an ankylosaur. But this is the lion of Christ killing a basilisk. This engraving on a cathedral in Austria dates to 1100 AD. We also got to note that many of the descriptions in the Bible that refer to dragons or serpents aren't favorable. The one in the Garden of Eden, number 1, Satan was the embodied a serpent. Okay? Also in the Revelation, you hear of Satan referred to as a dragon. And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. So the Bible refers to these serpents or dragons as being the embodiment of Satan himself. And I think some of these early Christians, seeing the way these communities were afraid of these things and knowing these references in the Bible, would have taken it upon themselves to kill these things. It's interesting thought, though, to think that not only were humans probably responsible, not some big asteroid, for dinosaur extinctions, but maybe Christians played a pretty significant role in that. Huh? Isn't that interesting? I don't know. But I found lots and lots of these kinds of things. This again is a picture of St. Michael killing the dragon, dating to the 4th century. You see a lot of these depictions and descriptions from history. And we also have to remember, it says in 2 Timothy, that the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. Although many people try to claim that the legends of dragons that are extensive in ancient cultures are themselves myths, the reality is that the myth is that these creatures lived 65 million years ago, went extinct 65 million years ago, tens of millions of years before humans ever walked the earth. When in reality, the fact is that God created not only that humans and all of these land animals on the exact same day, and they've lived on the earth until perhaps very recently. I wrote up there, if you want some more information, you can check one of our other websites. Much of what I included in here you may find in greater detail on the Creation Wiki. We started a website like Wikipedia, except just from the creation point of view. So very extensive, takes about 500,000 hits a month, but you might want to go on there and look at some more information.
The Maoris tell a legend about a giant eagle. And it's easy for us to say, oh, giant eagle, pff, whatever. But it's been verified and it's published. It's the real deal. It was a giant eagle. So if they were right about the giant eagle, then perhaps peoples have been telling the truth in their legends of other creatures too.
Most people today accept that dinosaurs have become extinct, and even creationists who look at the accounts of apparent recent human dinosaurial contact would say, look, it does seem that dinosaurs are extinct. However, there are some tantalizing accounts of sightings in very recent decades from various places around the world. In the Congo, for example, the local people there talk of a creature they call Mokele Mbembe. And when Westerners have gone in with drawings of African creatures and dinosaur handbooks, and they've pointed to pictures of, say, the hippopotamus or the rhino, the people have said, no, that's not Mokele Mbembe. And when shown a picture of a sauropod dinosaur in a dinosaur handbook, they've pointed to something like a small sauropod dinosaur. Another example comes to mind, the Lake Murray region of Papua New Guinea. There were people there out in a canoe, and as they looked under their canoe, they saw a large creature swim under the canoe that had what looked like triangular plates extending down its back and all the way down its long tail. And the people speak there of large nesting sites adjacent to the water's edge, which have been clearly left by a large creature.
There are a lot of things that over the years have been found that were thought to have been extinct. some mammals, some fishes, some plants. The coelacanth was the classic example from the early 1900s. The Wollemi pine, which was discovered in the later 1900s. So there's a lot of things that pop up that no one thought everyone thought went extinct. But it turns out that they're still here and they're essentially unchanged from the way they were supposedly millions of years ago.
And also there's an Australian living fossil that's very well known. It's called the Wollemi pine. And it was found in a very isolated part of a conservation reserve near Sydney in New South Wales. And it quickly became known as the dinosaur tree, because they said it had lived alongside the dinosaurs. And the initial dating of the Wollemi pine fossils was that it had been thought to be extinct for many millions of years.
Now, when they found this Wollemi pine just a short time ago, the curator of the Sydney Botanical Gardens apparently said, it's just like finding a live dinosaur. I think he said a live small dinosaur, because the point is it has exactly the same significance.
Now, the coelacanth is a fish. Fossils have been found of this fish that the evolutionists say died out, say, 70 million years ago, came on the scene about 400 million years ago. The reality is, in 1938, off of the island of Madagascar, fishermen started catching coelacanths. And so now the evolutionist is presented with a problem. If coelacanths died out 75 million years ago, what's a live one doing in 1938? And they found a lot more of them. Some are even in aquariums today.
Here's an interesting thing. Years ago, when I was in undergraduate school in Minnesota, I was taking a course in botany. And our professor took us all outside the botany building to pay obeisance to a ginkgo tree. And we all stood around in just deep reverence looking at this ginkgo tree, because we were told that this ginkgo tree, we can see it in the fossil record back to the time of the dinosaurs and beyond. And here it is growing alive and well just outside of our botany building. And isn't that amazing? And boy, we were impressed. But you know, now that I look back on that, why didn't our prof just show us the far more abundant oak trees and elm trees? Because they're in the fossil record too. We have acorns, we have walnuts. And these are dating back 40, 50 million years. No, I don't accept these dates. I believe the Earth is 6,000 years old. But if you're going to accept these dates, we have a tank here in the Creation Museum that is full of native Kentucky aquatic creatures. Sunfish, which have been found, the good old sunny you fish for, you know, if you like to fish. They were around back, according to the fossil record, 40, 50 million years ago. Garfish go back at least as far as the dinosaurs. We have the short-nosed gar in the tank. Turtles, 120 million years. Bats, 60 million years, 50 million years. And they look just like the bats do today.
Amber is what I call a time capsule. It is, some amber is supposed to be up to 50 million years old. And quite a bit of amber has what are called inclusions in it. Now, inclusions can be insects, they could be water, they could be oxygen or air bubbles, if you will. And the reason I call amber a time capsule is, lo and behold, when we find, for example, ants and termites, we've even found the pine bark beetle that is decimating the forests in the Rocky Mountain West. These animals, or these insects, if you will, are exactly the same as what we have today.
The Jurassic shrimp was supposed to become extinct during the Jurassic time, and yet they're alive and well and just as delicious today as back in the alleged evolutionary past. And so these living fossils, I think, are clear testimony to the youth of this Earth.
Evolution is this idea of survival of the fittest, which really means extinction of the unfit. The vast majority of everything goes extinct. And yet, how does Christianity approach things? The very kernel nut of Christianity is that not the survival of the fittest, but that the most fit of all, Jesus Christ, died for the unfit, so that the unfit could survive. That's me and you.